us. We thank you for this opportunity to come and study your word and to worship you without fear of persecution. Father, please be with us, guide us, and bless us. Please be with those members of our congregation who are ill and unable to attend services. We ask also that you be with those who may be experiencing difficulties and hardships in their personal lives. May you guide them, direct them. May you heal them, Lord, according to your will. We love you, Lord. We ask that you do this, learn more about your word, and we ask that you may forgive us, Lord. This is our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Amen. Well, once again, good morning, everybody. Do you have any announcements or information to share? No. I was just going to mention last night, about 36 of us from the congregation went out to Calm with California Living Museum, where they have that holiday lights display. This is the first time I'd seen it. It was really impressive. I'd been out there in the daytime a couple times before to see the animals. You know, it's kind of like a zoo. But I'd never been out at night, and it was super cool. I mean, it was just, somebody put a lot of time and effort into that. It's just beautiful. A little cold though. It was like in the 40s, so we were for the nice. I want to mention that. Of Jesus' parables for Luke chapter 20, the parable of the tenants. And I'm not going to rehash all that over again, but I just want to say this, that you know, it's amazing to me that, you know, when Jesus was alive, to tell a parable, it probably took him 3 or 4 minutes to say the whole thing. And yet, the number of lessons that we can extract as Christians from those parables, it's just mind-blowing. I mean, you could write a whole book on just that one, all the lessons that come out of it. And to me, it's just a very impressive thing that it works that way. Today, I wanted to talk more about some historical stuff. So the historical Jesus, as you will. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is that I recently became aware of a book that was written by a couple of researchers. Their names are, and I wrote their names down because I probably won't remember, James Valiant and Warren Fahey. And these two guys claim that they spent 30 years researching Jesus Christ and came to the conclusion that Christ is a fictitious character. That he never really existed, according to them. The name of their book is Creating Christ, How the Romans Invented Christianity. And I'll talk about the reasons as to why the Romans would do that in a minute. But I'd kind of like to address the issue as to why two highly educated researchers, probably PhDs, I'm sure they're PhDs, within our university system, would write a book trying to undermine the existence of Jesus Christ as a historical figure. And there's a few reasons. Number one, they're undoubtedly atheists. You know, there's no question about that. And I also suspect, I highly suspect, that they are progressive liberals. And progressive liberal for me is just a euphemism for a communist. You know, these people are entrenched in our university systems, in our universities and colleges in the United States. Any reference to Christianity or Jesus religion, because they don't believe in our Constitution, they want to get rid of our Constitution. And of course, it scores them a lot of political points, you know, with all the other people that are of that same mindset. Now, it's interesting that they don't have that point of view about Muslims. Notice that. But if you go to, you know, a university or a college, they'll have a room dedicated to Muslims so they can go in there and pray 6 times a day. So they don't have any problem with that. But if you're a Christian, you espouse Christianity, they want to, you know, eradicate that. They want to get rid of that. Anyway, back to this book. Once again, the book is called Creating Christianity, How the Romans, let me rephrase that, I said it wrong. Creating Christ, How the Romans Invented Christianity is the name of the book. And what they say is that not only did the Roman emperors make up Christ, and they never really existed, but that the Roman emperors also paid a group of Roman philosophers to fabricate all the books of the New Testament. And according to them, they supposedly did this as a group where they all collaborated so the books would agree with each other. And they wrote these individual books of the New Testament, which were not a complete volume at the time. They were just individual books, 26 or whatever there are. And that they distributed these books all throughout the Roman Empire individually to different places. And the Roman Empire was huge. I mean, it was the entire Western world as we know it. And then that's how Christianity started. Well, you know, if that's true, you know, theoretically speaking, then there really shouldn't be any references to a historical Christ in the 1st or 2nd century. If it's true that the Romans created this and they made it all up, there shouldn't be any historical documents in the 1st century that refer to Jesus Christ as a real person. But there are, and there's a lot of them. In fact, there's over 40 historical references to Jesus Christ. Any of you guys know who Tiberius was? Tiberius Caesar? You guys ever heard of that name? Yeah, so Tiberius was the emperor who ruled Rome during Jesus' time. When Jesus walked the earth, when Jesus was crucified, the Roman Caesar was Tiberius. I know you probably don't know the answer to this question. I'm just going to ask it rhetorically, but do you know how many historical references there are to Tiberius Caesar? And I'm sure people don't know that unless you've been reading. There's 10. There's 10 historical references, and they're all considered to be reliable and accurate to Tiberius within the historical record that we can retrieve. You know how many there are about Jesus? 42, okay? So you've got a guy who's an emperor of this huge empire. You know, we're talking, you know, Egypt, Spain, Western Europe, you know, including England, you know, all the Middle East, you know, Greece, all these countries. He's the emperor and ruler of all this, and there's 10 historical references to him. And then you have Jesus, who comes from a backwater village, son of a poor carpenter in a very unknown province, you know, Judea, the Roman Empire, and there's 42. So to me, it says something. So let's talk about, according to these, you know, Vallian and Fahey, you guys that wrote this book claiming that Christ is fictitious, what their premise is or what their thesis is. So what they say is that the reason the Romans did this was to pacify the people of Judea, which are the Jews, the Jewish people. And the reality is that the Romans had a lot of problems with the Jews. They had a lot of trouble with them. There were uprisings, there were revolts, there were rebellions, there was even a war. In the year 66 AD, you know, the Jewish-Roman War broke out. And, you know, and that resulted in AD 70, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And historians at the time estimated that between 1.3 and 1.4 million Jews were killed by the Romans during that war. And that's a lot of people. We think about the fact that there were probably 5 million Jews worldwide. Most of them were in Judea, but some were in other places. But if you have a total of 5 million Jews and like 1.3 or 1.4 million of them are killed, that's like one out of 4 people in their population were killed by the Romans during that war. So that's a pretty significant thing. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, it's an undisputed historical fact that the Romans had problems with the Jews, and that kind of operates. So what they're saying is that the Romans wanted to create a quote-unquote Roman-friendly political agenda, and they claim that the goal was to pacify anti-Roman sentiment by creating this pacifist type attitude. And they created this, you know, according to them, created this Jesus who would be against rebellion, he'd be against war, he would want people to, you know, agree with him. But the reason the Jews were so you know, adamant in their objections towards the Jews and towards the Romans was that the Romans were forced to accept things that were against their beliefs. And, you know, for example, you know, they were required to venerate the Roman emperor as a god, and the Jews would do that. You know, the Romans would come into their synagogues and they would put, you know, royal symbols of the emperor within the synagogues, and, you know, the Jews saw that as idolatry, as paganism, and they wouldn't accept it, and that was the reason why that they simply wouldn't go with the program. So once again, according to the authors of this book, the Roman emperors developed Christianity as a sophisticated government project, or you could say as an opiate for the Jewish population, for the purpose of pacifying them, for the purpose of making them stop, you know, revolting, rebelling, and having all these uprisings, creating all these issues so that the Romans didn't have to invest so many resources in trying to control Judea. But once again, as I said before, if that's true, there shouldn't be any historical references to Jesus, within the first century, because if he didn't really exist, no one would ever have written about him. He did. So I mentioned that there's like 42 historical references to Jesus. I'm not going to try to go over all those. That would be too many. But I do want to try to share my top 10. The top 10 non-biblical references to Jesus from the first century, first and second century, to be honest. Some of them are from early second century. So here's kind of my criteria. If a well-known historian documented a historical event that everyone accepts as true, and that same historian also documented Jesus, well, then you either have to accept both as true or both as false. You can't accept one and not accept the other because they both come from the same source. That would be inconsistent if your thought process was that. So what I'm going to try to do is talk about who these historians were, where they lived or when they lived, what they're known for, and talk about what they said about Jesus and try to determine what we can know about Jesus from non-biblical historical sources. So, for example, and just an example of what I'm going to talk about. Some of you probably heard of Josephus, Flavius Josephus. He's a well-known historian. He documented the destruction of Jerusalem, and he also documented the siege of Masada, where the Romans came in and destroyed Masada and killed everybody there. Well, they actually committed suicide before the Romans came in, but the Romans basically caused their deaths. Everyone accepts those things as historical fact. Nobody questions, nobody disputes those things. But Josephus also wrote about Jesus. Okay, he wrote a lot of stuff about Jesus as history, not as religion. So if we're going to accept his writings on the destruction of Jerusalem and his writings on the siege of Masada by the Romans, then we have to accept what he said about Jesus because they both come from the same source. So that's kind of the logic that I'm using as I present these things. So the first reference, and I'm going to do this kind of in ascending order, start from 10 and work up to 1. The first one is the early Christian writers, and that starts in the year AD 50 AD. So that's about 17 years after the death of Christ, which isn't that long. 17 years is not a great period of time, but that's when these guys, these early Christian writers started writing this stuff. So there's quite a number of them. I'm not going to name them all, but let's name a few. One was Clement of Rome, another one was Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, and these guys learned Christianity directly from people who had been with Jesus, who had seen Jesus, who had listened to Jesus. That's how they learned. They were, 17 years after Jesus' death. A lot of those people were still around. But there was in particular, his name was Quadratus of Athens. He was an early Christian writer who actually learned Christianity from the apostles, and that's in the historical record. Now, it wouldn't have been Judas, because Judas would have been dead, but Matthias replaced Judas, of course. But Quadratus of Antioch, who was an early Christian writer in the year 50 AD, learned Christianity directly from the 12 apostles at the feet of the apostles. Now, I'm going to read what he wrote, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the persecutions that they undertook or that they faced. But here's what Quadratus said, and I'm quoting his works. He said, "But the works of our Savior were always present, for they were genuine, those that were healed, those that were raised from the dead, who were seen not only when they were healed and were raised, but were also always present, not merely when the Savior was on earth, but also after his death. They were alive for quite a while, so that some of them lived even to our day." Signed, Quadratus. Now, Quadratus was writing this letter to Hadrian, who was a Roman emperor at the time. And what he's telling Hadrian is that he said, this stuff's genuine. This stuff really happened. Jesus was a real person. And he said, there are still people alive who were healed by Jesus, people who were sick, people who were brought back from the dead that Jesus performed miracles on, and they're still walking the earth. Why don't you go talk to them if you don't believe in this Christianity stuff and get the straight from the source? So that's pretty significant. The other significant thing for me is that all these early Christian writers were all executed for their beliefs. They were all put to death for being Christians, because being a Christian was illegal in the Roman Empire. it was against the law. It was viewed as, heresy, as you were treasonous or a traitor or something like that. So once again, this is an important testimony. It shows that Jesus was, a real person who actually lived on the earth, and that was Quadratus. Number 9 for me is a guy named Phlegon. Phlegon is spelled Phlegon. And Phlegon was around in the year 137 AD, and he was a historian. And Phlegon wrote an extensive history of the Olympic Games, starting in about 776 BC up until the 1st century. He wrote like 12 volumes, these huge books, detailing everything that happened in all the Olympic Games during that, several hundred period of time. And that's accepted as valid. Everybody believes that it's true. Nobody questions it. It's accepted as historical fact. Well, Phlegon also wrote about Jesus. And here's what he said. He said, Jesus had a knowledge of future events, and that the things Jesus predicted actually took place or actually came true. He also wrote about the eclipse, the blocking out of the sun and the earthquake when Jesus was crucified. He talked about that in great detail. He also said this: Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, meaning that he didn't try to save himself. He willingly went to his death. So he was no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death, and he exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed how his hands had been pierced with nails. So, that's a pretty impressive list of facts from Phlegon, talking about, the crucifixion, talking about how there was an eclipse, there was an earthquake at the time Jesus died, and that he rose from the death, and he showed people's hands. They could see, the marks in his hands from where he had been nailed to the cross. Number 8 is the historian Thallus, and this is from 55, which would have been about 22 years after Jesus' death. And what's interesting is this is written even before most of the books of the New Testament were written. The book of Matthew might have been in existence at that point in time, but most of the rest hadn't even been written because they were written at a later time. So the original document that Thallus wrote in AD 55 didn't survive. It was lost. But it was quoted by a later historian named Julius Africanus in about 200 AD, and he quoted Thallus. And here's what he said about Jesus, speaking about the crucifixion from AD 55. Thallus said this: "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness." Once again, on the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were split by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down, meaning all the buildings collapsed when this earthquake took place. And speaking of darkness, Thallus wrote this: the darkness to me to be without reason, an eclipse of the sun. Well, that's exact. Chapter 15, verse 33, when in the 6th hour the sun was eclipsed. And that would have been what time? Maybe like 12 noon, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And there was no sun. The sky would be dark. So once again, a historical reference to Jesus by someone who was there when that happened. Number 7 is a guy named Celsus. Celsus was a 2nd century Greek philosopher, and he was known for writing a pretty impressive set of medical texts. It was like 12 volumes that he wrote. Celsus wrote these texts. It was called De Medicina, which in Latin means about medicine or of medicine. And everybody accepts those medical texts as historically accurate. Nobody questions them. Nobody says that they're fake or they're false or anything like that. It's believed to be, true, everything that he wrote about that stuff. And, Celsus also wrote about Jesus, the same guy that wrote all those medical texts. Now, Celsus is not in favor of Jesus. He's contrary to Jesus. He's attacking Jesus. And he wrote a treatise, or like an essay, where he accuses Jesus of having invented his birth from a virgin. So he criticizes Jesus, and he says this. He says, quote, "Being born in a certain Jewish village of a poor country woman who gained her subsistence by spinning, who had been kicked out of the house by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery." And then he goes on to talk about how Jesus went to Egypt and acquired these miraculous powers and used these miraculous powers to try to claim that he was God. So Celsus obviously didn't believe in Jesus. He was attacking Jesus. He was critical of him. But at the same time, he's establishing certain historical facts about Jesus that are undeniable. So, it was widely known that Jesus was born of a virgin, that he was known to perform miracles, and that he claimed to be divine. So that's the significant part of what Celsus said back in the 2nd century. Number 6 is a guy named Lucian of Samosata. Lucian is Lucin, and that's in about AD 165. So Lucian was a satirist. He wrote satire, in other words, like biting humor that's critical of other people and laughs at other people. And he wrote a play in which he mentions the Christians and Christianity. And of course, he's mocking Christians when he says these things. But here's what he says. He says, "The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account." So we have a number of interesting historical facts, and even though he's critical, he's a hostile witness against Jesus, but he's also establishing a number of facts that we would all accept and would all know to be true as Christians. So he's acknowledging that Jesus is the founder of a religion, that he was crucified, that his followers considered themselves spiritual brothers and sisters, and that they all worship this man as God, which, of course, we know Jesus was. Once again, this is from a hostile witness. Number 5 on the list is a guy named Mara bar Serapion. And Serapion lived in AD 73. He was not a Christian. He was a Syrian. He was actually a Stoic philosopher who had been arrested by the Romans, and he was put into prison by the Romans. And while Serapion was in prison, he wrote a letter to his son, and in this letter, he referred to Jesus, and he referred to Jesus as a wise king who was unjustly executed by the Jews. So here's what he said about Jesus, this Serapion guy in 73 AD. He said, "He was a doer of incredible deeds and a teacher who attracted many followers from both the Jews and the Greeks." Marr also claimed that Jesus lived on through his teachings, which his followers continued to spread, and that they formed the tribe of Christians. Okay, so once again, we have a guy that's not a Christian. He wasn't a part of the religion, didn't believe in Jesus, but lived at that time, was aware of his existence, and he wrote about it. Number 4 is Pliny the Younger, and I'm going to have to take a little time to talk about Pliny the Younger. So Pliny the Younger was a Roman historian. He was also a magistrate, like a judge, and he was also the governor of a Roman province, the province of Bithynia, as it was called at that time. Now, Pliny the Younger is not to be confused with Pliny the Elder. They were uncle and nephew, so Pliny the Younger was the nephew, Pliny the Elder was the uncle. What's interesting about Pliny the Younger in terms of his historical contribution to what we now know history is that he was a witness to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 AD. So I know we've all probably heard about that, but the reason we know about that is because Pliny the Younger is the one that documented it historically. Now, he was in a safe place when this happened. He was in the town of Misnium, which is about a half mile away across a bay, across an expanse of water from Pompeii when Vesuvius blew up and all the lava and hot ash came down and destroyed everything. But what's interesting about it is that his uncle, Pliny the Elder, was killed at that time. So what Pliny the Elder, he was also a historian like his nephew. He hired some people to get on a boat, and he tried to go right up to the beach of Pompeii while this eruption was taking place. You guys know how hot it was in the town of Pompeii and Herculaneum when Vesuvius erupted? It was like 900 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, that's going to cook anything. Nothing's going to survive. Nothing that is going to survive in that type of heat. So when Pliny the Elder went up to this beach in this boat, I mean, they were just immediately cooked. The boat probably caught on fire, burned up very quickly, and of course, he died. But Pliny the Younger, observed this, reported it, told us all about it, and of course we all know that Pompeii and Herculaneum were later excavated. They were preserved under, a couple, 2 or 3 feet of volcanic ash, and everything in these cities was as it was at that time in 79 AD when everybody, died and everything was destroyed, and it's an awesome historical record. But once again, Pliny the Younger wrote a historical account of the eruption, and the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and nobody questions that. Nobody says, "Oh, that's wrong," or he he couldn't have seen that, or everybody accepts it as the truth, as historical truth. Well, the interesting thing is that Pliny also wrote about Christianity at that same period of time. So it's the same author, the same source of information. And while Pliny was the Roman governor of the province of Bithynia in Italy, there were some Christians that were arrested, a group of Christians. And Pliny interrogated them because they were considered criminals. As I said before, Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire up until 330 AD. And he sent a letter to Emperor Trajan asking for advice on how to deal with Christians that he was prosecuting. And I'm going to read what he wrote in a minute, but I think it's worth mentioning. I don't want to get into the horrible, awful details about how they tortured Christians, but I'm going to mention a little bit about it. When the Romans interrogated a Christian, it wasn't like they just sat you down in a chair and asked you questions. The only way that they could be convinced you were telling the truth was to torture you. So they did horrible things. They would do things like they would have a cat of nine tails whip, and they would literally flay the skin off your back while they're questioning you. Or they would take, some metal pinchers, would pull your fingernails out. Or they would take red hot irons and they would burn the bottoms of your feet. And the reason they did these things was they believed, it was their philosophy, that a person would never really tell the truth unless they were being tortured while they're being questioned. I don't agree with that, but that's what they did. And that's what happened to these Christians that Pliny was referring to in this letter that he wrote to Trajan. So here's what he said. And this is a quote from Pliny the Younger. He said, "The Christians declared that the sum of their guilt or their error amounted only to this, that on a stated day of the week, which would have been Sunday, they were accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god, and by binding themselves by oath not to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, from robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it." So here's the thing that kind of stands out for me. If Jesus never actually existed, if he was a fictitious figure like these authors in this book that I talked about claim, how do you explain the exponential growth of Christianity? Christianity in the first century just grew like wildfire. It went from one town to another town, and multiple towns at the same time. Hundreds, thousands of people were immediately converting to Christianity. The second thing is that how many of us in here had never having seen Christ and not having any witnesses that ever talked about Christ and not really believing that Christ existed would be willing to give up our lives and die for our belief in Christ? I don't think any of us would. We would have to be firmly 100% convinced that Jesus is Christ. And what the Romans would do with these people they were interrogating was, if they would renounce Jesus Christ and swear allegiance to the Roman emperor as God, they would let him go. So if you were being interrogated as a Christian and they tortured you and asked all these questions, they would say, do you renounce Christ? And if you said yes, then they would tell you, okay, you have to curse Christ. So you have to use all these expletives, foul names, whatever, and curse, Christ and everything that he stands for. And then you have to bow down to a statue of the emperor and swear that you're going to worship him for the rest of your life. If you would do that, they would let you go. But the Christians wouldn't do that. It didn't matter how they tortured. It didn't matter what type of pain or how, whatever they did to them in terms of, the torturous process they went through. None would have renounced Christ, and they were all ended up being executed. Do you think that they would have done that if Christ was a historical figure? If he was a fictitious figure, if he never really existed? I don't think so. I don't think people would, but that's actually the situation. So number 3, got a couple more to go after this, is Suetonius. Suetonius was a Roman historian in the AD 120, and he was known for his historical texts about the lives of the Caesars. So he wrote several volumes of the lives of the Caesars, like what they did every day, what decisions they made, what they were in charge of, their personalities, and all those kinds of things. And he documented the lives of the Roman emperors from Julius Caesar to Domitian. And in his section on the life of Claudius, who was one of the Roman emperors, he wrote this. He said, Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, Christus is the way you say Christ in Latin. So at the instigation of Christus, Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. Well, we have that same phrase, that same information in Acts chapter 18, where it talks about Aquila and Priscilla, who were a married couple who were working with the Apostle Paul, mentioned several times in the New Testament. And it talks about the Emperor Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome because they were causing riots and rebellions due to the Christians, and he kicked them all out. Well, this reflects that from a non-biblical source and is a clear reference to Christ. It's the same thing that we have in the book of Acts. All right, so number 2 is Flavius Josephus, and I need a minute or two to talk about him, but this is from AD 93. So Josephus was a Jew. He was not a Christian. He didn't believe in Christianity. He believed in the traditional Jewish ideas that Jews still believe in today, which is to not accept Christ as the Messiah. But he actually mentions Jesus twice in his works. His works are called the Antiquities of the Jews. And there is a controversial passage that has been around for a while where he talks about Christ. And I just want to mention that because most scholars do not accept it as being truthful or being, actually real. And in this reference that is questionable within the Antiquities of the Jews written by Josephus, it says something like, God sent Jesus to earth as the Messiah, and he taught the way to salvation. He died on the cross and then was resurrected on the third day so that everyone could have everlasting life through belief in his name. Well, a Jew would never say that because Jews don't believe that. They would never espouse that type of thing. And for good reason, it was believed that at some point during history, a Christian scribe edited that. They changed it to make it more favorable to Christianity. So for many, many years, it's been questioned. However, an original source of Josephus's writings was found in 1970 in Saudi Arabia, believe it or not. It was written in Arabic, had been translated from Greek into Arabic, which has been determined to actually be what Josephus wrote. It's the actual verified account of what he wrote. And that's a little more reasonable. But he does talk about Jesus Christ. And once again, this has been verified and accepted as historical proof. And here's what it said in the original work. It said, quote, "At this time there was a wise man called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." So that was the bulk of what Josephus said about Jesus. And as I said before, it's determined to be the original writing of Josephus as opposed to that one that had been edited by some later Christian scribe. But Josephus actually referred to Jesus a second time when he talks about the death of James, who was the brother of Jesus. And when he talks about the death of James, the brother of Jesus, when he talks about Jesus, he refers to him as the one who is called Christ. He's not calling him Christ because he doesn't believe in Christianity, but he refers to him as the one who is called Christ. So, from these references, we can see that Josephus accepted the existence of Jesus historically, that he's saying he was a real person. And of course, his works is all history. It's all the historical events that occurred within the Roman Empire within a given period. And of course, he included the life of Jesus in that as a significant person who lived during that period of time. Okay, so the last one, number 1, is Tacitus. And Tacitus is a Roman historian from 116 AD. He left us a couple of important works. They were histories and annals. By annals, what I mean is he did like a year-by-year summary of everything that happened in the Roman Empire within that given year. We still do that today, but he was doing this back in 116 AD. And in his annals, one of the things he wrote about was Nero, the Roman Emperor Nero, who was known to be crazy. And one of the things that Nero did was He started a fire that actually burned up all of Rome, the Great Fire of Rome. He was responsible for that. So, historians say that he was, supposedly under the influence. He was out of his mind, having all these hallucinations. Went around Rome lighting fires to all these wooden structures, because most of the buildings were built, made out of wood. And then as Rome burned, he walked around playing his fiddle and laughing and dancing, while he's watching everything burn down. Well, the Roman people knew that Nero was responsible for doing this, and he started getting a lot of negative kickback, a lot of negative criticism. So what does he do? He decides to blame it on the Christians. He's going to say the Christians are responsible for starting this fire. So within that context, Tacitus, this Roman historian that I mentioned, wrote about that, and here's what he wrote. Quote, consequently, to get rid of the report that Nero was responsible for starting the fire, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, Latin for Christ, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And the most mischievous superstition, I'm going to come back to the term mischievous superstition because that has a meaning. A most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Sounds like San Francisco. So the mischievous superstition during that period of time in Roman history was a reference to the resurrection of Christ. So if you're a Roman, you don't believe that Christ actually resurrected from the dead, but all the Christians are talking about this and claiming it happened, and they referred to that idea as the mischievous superstition. So that's what Tacitus is talking about. So this passage is really of great importance historically. First of all, there's no question as to its authenticity. It's recognized by all scholars, Christians and non-Christians, as being authentic, that it's true. It's from that time period just after Jesus' death. Second, scholars view Tacitus as an independent source, not related in any way to the Gospels. He had nothing to do with the New Testament Gospels or writing Gospels, or didn't know anybody involved in that. And third, it just confirms a lot more of the details about the life of Jesus Christ. So he talks about Jesus being called Christus, which is Christ in Latin, as I said before. Talks about his death under Pontius Pilate. We talked about it. He mentions the mischievous superstition, which was widely known at that time to refer to the stories about the resurrection of Christ, which the Romans didn't believe in. And, so even if we didn't have the New Testament, based on all these things that I've gone over, so we assume the New Testament didn't exist. We don't have that information. Here's everything that we would know from non-biblical sources, from just historical sources that don't have anything to do with the Bible. Number one, he was reported to have been of a poor virgin. He was born of a poor virgin, and his father was a carpenter. That's the first thing. Second thing, he was a teacher. His disciples passed on his teachings to other people, so they spread the word. He prophesied and he performed miracles. He was known for his wisdom and his virtuous life. He claimed to be God. He was crucified by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar in Judea. There was an earthquake and darkness that accompanied his death. His followers reported that he'd risen from the dead, and he appeared to them after he resurrected. He showed them the wounds in his hands. His followers worshipped him as a god. Belief in the Jews caused disturbances with the Jews, which led to Claudius' decree for the Jews to be evicted from Rome. So that's a pretty precise summary of Jesus' life, and it contains almost all the essential elements that we get from the Bible about Jesus' life, except it's not in the Bible. So I believe, based on all that we can prove that Jesus existed historically, even without the Bible. So going back to this book that I talked about at the beginning of all this, by Valiant and Fahey, that Jesus was a historical figure created by the Romans. They made up all the books of the Bible, and they did this to pacify the Jewish population. I absolutely can't believe that's true. I simply can't believe it. And here's the nail in the coffin to that premise or that theory that these authors are trying to present. If the Romans made up all this stuff because they were trying to pacify the Jews, they're trying to get them to calm down and stop fighting against the Romans, to accept their rule and not create any problems, then why for 3 centuries were they going around killing all the Christians for being Christians? That makes no sense to me. You're trying to get them to calm down and cooperate and pacify themselves so that they'll do what you want them to do, and at the same time you're going to go around and kill them all? I mean, that's just diametrically opposed. That's just contradictory, and it makes no sense to me. So the summary that I want to give you of all this is that I think this book by these 2 guys, that the Romans created Christ, is a bunch of baloney. I don't believe there's any historical basis for it. I think it's politically motivated by, the people in the university system who are progressive liberals that want to get rid of Christianity, any mention of Christ or Jesus or anything like that. And I don't think it's anything that we as Christians need to be concerned about. That can very easily be disputed and disproved. So that's my take on that. Before we finish up, any questions or comments about any of that stuff or anything at all? We all good? All right. Thanks for listening. Appreciate you being here, and hopefully see you all next time.